So let's take a look at some of the unique aspects of California's electoral system. In California state government, there are 9 constitutional offices who are elected statewide, except for the 4 members of the Board of Equalization who are constitutional offices, but they are elected in 4 distinct districts the state is split up in. There are, of course, 120 legislative seats between the state assembly and the state senate. The constitutional officers are limited to serving 2 4-year terms in each office. And having to run statewide is obviously a major cost driver in fundraising for any of those statewide offices. While there are higher campaign contribution limits for these offices, there's still enormous pressure to raise vast sums of money for campaigning up and down the state of California and purchasing airtime in our major media markets. For the legislative offices, California has 120 state legislators who have lower campaign contribution limits than those candidates for statewide office. Assembly members have to run for re-election every 2 years, and state senators have to run for re-election every 4 years. They can serve a maximum of 12 years in either house or a combination of the 2 houses. Here too, there's also enormous pressure to raise money and actively campaign until one's final term in office. With regard to our judicial offices, there are 2 ways to be a Superior Court judge in California, either through appointment by the governor for a vacancy which he can fill, or to run for office. For the appellate court justice spots, it's by gubernatorial appointment only. In other words, you can't run for an appellate court seat. And they are subject to a retention election every 12 years. What are some unique aspects of California's electoral system? Well, since we ended on judicial retention elections, let's start with judicial elections. As opposed to federal judgeships, which are lifetime appointments under the federal Constitution, Article 3, California judges are generally appointed by the governor. Then they're subject to the Judicial Nominations Commission, which is generally referred to as the Jenny Commission. And ultimately, they're subject to voter approval through the use of a retention election every 12 years. In Governor Jerry Brown's first term of office, 3 state Supreme Court justices were removed from office. Now, they were not recalled. They failed in that retention election, so they couldn't continue in office. In June 2018, a Superior Court judge was recalled from office due to a light sentence he had imposed on a sex offender. Now, keep in mind that judges are political in a limited sense. The governor and legislature provide funding for the courts, including their salaries and staff. It's not done by an independent body, for example. The legislature and governor can obviously change the law, overturn a decision that's rendered by the judicial branch. So I think judges in this state are pretty aware of the powers of the other 2 branches of government and the roles that each of the 3 co-equal branches of government play. California's electoral system is not unique among the states because individuals run for elected office for a myriad of reasons, and the vast majority of them never make it into elected office. But the judicial elections in the state are actually limited, as I mentioned, just to the trial courts, which we call the Superior Court. And no one can run for either the Court of Appeal or the California Supreme Court. There are 3 significant measures that I think have impacted California's electoral system. The first is the top 2 primary. The second is the modified term limits law that we live under. And then the third is the Independent Redistricting Commission. And so I'll just briefly cover all 3. Starting with the top two primary, historically, California had followed the regular approach for June, or sometimes we had them in March for presidential elections. But the June primary, by having the top Democrat candidate and the top Republican vote getter face each other in the November general election. That all changed when a budget deal resulted in the top two primary system being placed on the statewide ballot, and ultimately it was adopted by California's voters. And so here in the state of California, the two candidates who proceed to the November general election are the two candidates with the most votes in the primary election. That means that there can be two Democrats facing each other, two Republicans facing each other, or a Democrat facing a Republican, or perhaps a candidate from a third party. Now, the intent of this ballot measure is stated by then Senator Abel Maldonado and Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, both of who advocated for the passage of this ballot measure, is to cause candidates to hopefully moderate their positions, with the idea being that they'll have to appeal to a majority of voters in the primary election rather than wait for a general election to do so. So far, that intent has not been really borne out by the experiences we've seen. In other words, there have been numerous instances where the same party's candidates face each other both in June and in November, or that a more conservative or more progressive candidate still won in the November general election. Perhaps at some point, this perceived reform of the election process will bring the changes desired by its proponents. Next is the term limits law. Term limits were first instituted in the California State Legislature in 1990 by Proposition 140, which was adopted by the voters. The proponents had demonized then Assembly Speaker Willie Brown and got the voters to adopt some pretty strict term limits for members of the legislature. So the assembly terms were limited to a mere 3 two-year terms, and the Senate to just 2 four-year terms. These brief term limits meant that legislators were constantly running for office. Public policy issues, a lot of them were getting ignored or not adequately addressed by legislators. Certainly in a long-term view of these things, at least according to the critics. The total time in office for a lifetime was 14 years, assuming that the candidate could successfully get elected in both houses and that the timing worked out to do so. As a result, there were two efforts. The first, unfortunately, was unsuccessful. The second was, however, successful to change that term limits law. According to political pundits, the first measure basically failed because it was retroactive in its application, in that it would have applied to legislators who were in office at the time that the voters adopted the measures or the measure, and the state's electorates didn't care for that approach. So that measure was rejected by California voters. The second modification to the original term limits law, the successful one, changed the term limits law to allow a maximum of 12 years of service in either house or in a combination of the two. I think the likely reason that this version passed is because it was actually pitched to the voters as reducing the total amount of time that an individual could spend in the legislature from a total of 14 years under Prop 140 to a total of 12 years under this measure. The idea here was to allow legislators to serve the entire time in one house, which in theory would bring some stability, hopefully, to both houses of the legislature, and allow legislators to take a longer term look of public policy issues, their proposed solutions, and of course, legislation. And hopefully, by addressing those issues with a longer term view, because they would be in the seat for as long as 12 years, that hopefully they would be more successful in the solutions that they adopted to address these public policy problems. There was also talk that legislators would serve on fewer committees, spend more time in their districts, conduct more oversight and investigative activities, and develop long-term expertise in their subject matters. According to the political pundits, I think the jury's still out on whether some of these additional term limit reform uh, results might actually happen at some point. In the meantime, I think there continues to be a lot of the same complaints from observers of the California legislative process that there are still efforts to push through last minute legislation that hasn't been properly vetted. Legislators are still moving around with different committee assignments, maybe not developing the same level of expertise that they are running for local or federal offices and actually not staying put in one house for 12 years. So the jury's still out on this one. The third item is the Independent Redistricting Commission. Now, as with most legislatures around the country, California had long given the job of drawing district lines for members of the legislature, the US House, and the State Board of Equalization to the legislature itself. So critics claim that the incumbents were always protecting their own every decade in the after the decennial census, and challengers had a tougher time taking on those long-term incumbents who had been in office for so long. Also, those in the minority party often complained that legislative district drawing had actually resulted in seats that ensured the majority party controlled, and that there were a few so-called toss-up seats that might actually change party hands. Well, eventually the voters spoke and they approved ballot measures that took this job out of the hands of the legislature and placed that the district redrawing with the Independent Citizens Commission to draw all of those political boundaries for BOE members, the US House of Representatives, and the state Senate and state Assembly. The belief of the proponents was that district lines would be drawn in a nonpartisan and more fair manner that hopefully wouldn't guarantee incumbent protection and might result in more competitive seats and additional minority party representation. Since that time, however, Democrats have actually increased their ranks substantially in both the Senate and Assembly. And ironically, now some Republican legislators have privately complained that they actually prefer the earlier approach, which might have protected them from losing as many seats as they have. Finally, as an important part of California's electoral system, we have Prop 34 that was adopted by the voters on campaign finance law. It provides contribution limits on the amount of funds that can be contributed to candidates for statewide office and state legislative offices, etc. There's one important distinction between federal and state campaign laws. In California, corporate contributions can be made. However, at the federal level, they're prohibited. And so only individual contributions can be made unless, for example, a business has created a political action committee, a PAC, which combines individual contributions made to that PAC. Also in California, state legislators are elected pursuant to what's called a plurality vote in single winner contests. They don't use ranked choice voting or multi-winner voting except in some local jurisdictions. The same occurs with constitutional officers who are elected on a statewide basis. Some local governments utilize a multi-winner election where multiple candidates can be elected to the same office, such as a city council. And there's a handful of local jurisdictions in the state that utilize ranked choice voting. States are allowed to determine which particular electoral system they want to use for state offices. For federal offices, they obviously have to follow the requirements of the federal Constitution.